Hi, and welcome to the lecture for Module 5. Today we'll be talking about the two artists, Bramante and Leonardo da Vinci. One name perhaps you've heard before, I hope you've heard before. The other may not be quite as familiar, but Bramante is considered one of the most important architects working in the entire Renaissance. We'll be looking at a number of his buildings today. Some of the major points we'll be talking about include some of the architectural developments of Bramante, both in Milan, where he starts out his career, and in Rome. We'll also talk about the movement to Rome as a cultural center. So for the most part, we've been talking about Florence, although we have mentioned some other cities. But this is the point where we start to see Rome really rise in prominence. And that's because the power of the papacy is growing pretty considerably. That's not to say things aren't important elsewhere. We'll also talk about Florence with Leonardo, among other people. But Rome has a certain primacy in the 16th century. And finally, we'll look at the new naturalism of Leonardo da Vinci. His work and the works of his contemporaries are quite different than what came before. So we're moving away from what's considered the early Renaissance and now moving to the high Renaissance. So I want to start with a couple of buildings in Milan designed by Bramante. So here I'm showing you the Church of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, and this was begun in the year 1463. We're going to be focusing on an addition made to Guinforte Solari's church by the architect Bramante. That is primarily the tribune, which you can see here in the photo on the left. On the right, I'm showing you a view of the interior looking towards the tribune. So the main door is behind us in this viewpoint. At this point in time, Milan is the most powerful and influential court in Italy. Francesco Sforza becomes the ruler of Milan in 1450. There was a brief time when Milan tried to establish itself as a republic from 1447 to 1450, and that was largely because the Sforza had shaky claims to legitimate rulership. Francesco Sforza's son, Ludovico Sforza, becomes the dominant ruler after his father's death, ousting his brother Galeazzo's widow from her regency, and Ludovico was proclaimed duke in 1494. And we see with the Sforza, and especially Ludovico, the use of the visual arts to legitimize his rule. Ludovico has a few churches restored and refurbished, and he hires Bramante to do these projects as his head architect. One of these churches is Santa Maria delle Grazie, which I'm showing you here, which is very near to his residence, the Castello Sforzesco, the Sforza Castle. This was the church chosen by Ludovico as his family mausoleum, and Bramante's addition is done in a grand classicizing style. So here I'm showing you a detailed view looking towards the main apse of the church. You see the high altar in the very center underneath the dome. And in the photo on the right, we're looking at that apse extension that you see in the back of the photo to the left. This was perhaps done in collaboration with a couple of other artists, including Leonardo da Vinci, because he was also at the court of Ludovico Sforza at this time. What Bramante does is he adds this large domed tribune with three apsidal extensions. So we're seeing the apse sticking out here on the right, but in fact all three walls of this addition have apse-like spaces there, these hemicycles, semicircular projections out from the church walls. The general theme is derived from something designed by Brunelleschi in Florence, in fact the old sacristy at San Lorenzo, which unfortunately we didn't have time to discuss. But what we see here is a vast expanse of space, and that idea is probably deriving from some late antique structures in the city. We see with Bramante's addition less of an emphasis on walls and masonry. We find simple architectural details, lots of oculi that are these circular windows, lots of circular forms in general actually. And so the oculi are echoed by these painted roundels, which combines inlaid stone with paint as well. And you see these roundels on the arches over each apsidal extension, as well as in the pendentives, these triangular shaped things which harmonize the square shape of the tribune with the circular dome. And you also see the circles on the ribs of this dome. So Bramante is actually using quite a few classicizing elements. The roundels are a little classicizing, but more we see it in the use of these pilasters lining the walls with classicizing capitals with this continuous frieze, also decorated with roundels. It's a good example of his classicizing style in the late 15th century. Another one of his major projects while he is working in Milan is this church called Santa Maria presso San Satiro. And what that means is St. Mary's near St. Satiro's. And so what Bramante has done is he's enlarged this church from a smaller, older chapel, which we can actually see in the ground plan right here, and in the photo at the top left right here. So the circular structure is here in plan, and the entire church is the reconception of Bramante. It's a very interesting plan. It follows most churches with its transept here. At the crossing, that is where the transept meets the nave, you have a covered dome space. You can see that it's a single aisle inside, and here I'm showing you a view towards the high altar, so a view coming from right here in the plan, and then aisles on either side, and it's quite open, and there's a lot of communication from side to side. Bramante is very interested in centrally planned buildings. He and Leonardo both are, but you can see it where Bramante incorporates centrally planned structures here. So although this is a Latin cross plan for the most part, you also see the sacristy over here, which is a centrally planned structure, and then the circular San Satiro, which actually is a combination of forms. So you have a square inscribed inside the circle, which you can actually see in its elevation as well. The really significant aspect of this building, though, is the apse. So if you look at this image I'm showing you here, it appears that from the nave extends a large chapel ending in a flat apse. So instead of semicircular, it's a flat wall. But in fact, if you look at the plan, there is hardly any recession at all. Look right here, that is the extent of the recession. So everything you're seeing in the image on the right is an illusion. He uses perspectival techniques to make it look like an actual extension of space, when in fact it's just illusionistic stucco and recession. Now the reason he flattens out this apse is because the site was constrained by a pre-existing street. And so he uses a perspectival system that we've seen developing in painting to create the illusion of an apse. And so even just like in a painting, we see a vanishing point. Here it's converging on what's called the monstrance, the container that holds the sacrament of the Eucharist. Here are just a couple of drawings by Leonardo da Vinci, also showing his interest in centrally planned structures. So we see a couple of different ideas for centrally planned structures in plan form, as well as in an elevation of what it would look like actually built. And there's this interest in the centrally planned. It's an important classicizing type. It allowed Renaissance architects to harmonize an interior using perfect geometrical forms. The circle and the square were considered to be the perfect forms echoed in everything in the cosmos. None of Leonardo's projects were ever executed, but they seem to have had a profound effect on Bramante. In fact, a lot of these centrally planned structures resemble his addition at Santa Maria delle Grazie, as well as some of his future projects. So now moving to Rome, I want to show you what is probably Bramante's most well-known and influential building there. It's this little circular structure called the Tempietto. This is in the courtyard of a church called San Pietro in Montorio, which was said to be the site of St. Peter's execution. And so this place, this exact site that this little dome structure is marking, was said to be the site of his execution and was thus an important pilgrimage center. It was built on quite a narrow site in this small cloister between the church on the left and then another cloister on the right. Now, a centrally planned structure is often also associated with the idea of a martyrium, or a building that is celebrating a martyr who died on that site. And so this idea of a memorial is suggested in the plan of the building. Now here on the left, I'm showing you a print from an architectural treatise by Sebastiano Serlio that is publishing what Bramante actually wanted to do at the site. So in the center, you largely see the Tempietto as built in a ground plan, but hopefully you can see the difference between this rectangular courtyard that it lies in and the circular courtyard that Bramante envisioned. he saw the possibility of creating a series of concentric circles, probably a covered arcade on the exterior, followed by an open circular area directly surrounding the Tempietto. The stairs leading up to it also act as concentric circles leading up to the interior of the building, the cella, the holiest part of the space. The Tempietto is often considered a perfect example of a Doric temple, and the Doric is the simplest of the three major architectural orders. The easiest place to spot an architectural order is always in the capital of the columns, and these are very standard Doric capitals here. The Doric is also characterized by this running frieze of what are called metopes and triglyphs, so you've got a little bit of sculptural variation here. Even though this is considered the perfect Doric temple, in fact, we have nothing like this surviving from antiquity. So Bramante was taking some ideas from Renaissance and ancient treatise writers and adapting them to what he considered what could be a perfect building here. There is one other major difference aside from the plan of the courtyard. Bramante actually intended that the Tempietto should be opened on all four sides. As it was built, though, we see that this actually gets closed up, and there is no exit on the back side. You can go into this space and then you're in this beautiful, perfect domed interior, and then you can actually follow it around to the left, and then you find a set of stairs leading you downwards, because if this had been built as Bramante wanted it, the altar would have been right in the middle, which would have been kind of strange. It's not the same sort of focal point that most Christian spaces are used to. Bramante's other really, really well-known project was the beginning of the reconstruction of the Church of St. Peter's. So the reconstructions I'm showing you here are of Old St. Peter's, the church built by Constantine in the early part of the 4th century. It had remained standing with later additions and some restorations, of course. But during the late 15th and early 16th century, we see the popes becoming very interested in rebuilding the structure that was about to fall down. On top here, I'm showing you what the Vatican looked like prior to Bramante being called to Rome by the Pope Julius II. Julius II is a name you should memorize now because he becomes a very important patron for lots and lots of artists living at this time, including Michelangelo and Raphael, which we'll talk about in the future. So in the ground plan that I'm showing you above, you can see the layout of Old St. Peter's, transept, large nave, very typical basilica style. You can see the large courtyard in front, and then also you can see the constructions of the Vatican Palace, these large black areas here, this wall extending out to this small villa, which was called the Belvedere, which is where the popes could have a sort of leisure area. Under Julius II, all of this gets dramatically altered. So what the bottom image is showing you is an overlay of what Bramante's project would have looked like if it could overlay the old building. And even though eventually the rest of the nave of Old St. Peter's, which you can see right here, eventually that gets demolished, it's likely that Bramante would have intended to keep the forecourt, even though architecturally they're just dramatically different. Bramante was also responsible for enlarging the Belvedere, and I'll show you a few images of that. He also built this huge long series of hallways and other types of rooms connecting the Vatican Palace to the Belvedere. This was basically Julius II commissioning Bramante to turn the papal palace into a princely residence. The villa over here was a very important residence for Julius, and it was where he placed his significant collection of antiquities, which forms the core of the Vatican museums today. So the Belvedere doesn't survive as Bramante built it today because of later papal intervention, so I'm going to have to show you a couple of drawings. What you're seeing here is Bramante's project under construction. So we're looking away from St. Peter's. We can see on the right side the beginning of Bramante's significant corridors here and the expansion of the Belvedere at the very top of the drawing, whereas on the left side of the drawing we see that very little has been done except for some foundations. In addition to constructing this actual masonry, what Bramante was doing was enclosing this dramatic terraced courtyard where lots and lots of festivities took place. It basically became a theater. So if you look at it in these views, for example, down in this print at the bottom. If you look over to the left where the Vatican Palace is, you can see the Dome of St. Peter's under construction here. You can see the seating area so that people could come and watch plays, jousts, and things of that nature inside this dramatic courtyard. And you can see lots of Bramante's additions here as well. But it was one of the most famous places for pagan spectacles, and this is probably why a later pope built a huge wing of the Vatican Library across it to destroy it. It was also inspired by this massive temple at a city not too far away from Rome called Palestrina. You can see the similarities in the terracing design from the drawing I showed you above and from the remains of this temple in Palestrina. And at that time, this temple was actually thought to be a palace of Julius Caesar. So it's an example of the popes adapting what they thought were imperial types for their own purposes. Here's a view of what Bramante's project looks like today, his extension of the palace here. And here you can see the long courtyard with the additions by that later pope. This wing right here is the one that's actually added in the 1580s, whereas the second wing behind it is added in the 19th century to hold the expanding antiquities collection of the Vatican museums. Now, my favorite element of Bramante's addition can actually be seen right here in this print. He added this massive stair tower so that the Pope could access the villa not just from the corridors that Bramante had built, but also from outside of the courtyard. So this stair tower is what I am about to show you. Here it is seen straight on and also from below looking upwards. What we have in the staircase is 4 complete spirals, each of 1 story high. Each story has 8 columns, and each of these are of a different architectural order. So in the image on the left here, you can see 2 different column capital types. What we're seeing here is the transition from the Doric to the Ionic, and the Ionic is characterized by these volutes that you see here. Below the Doric is what's called the Tuscan, and then on top of the Ionic is the composite, which is the most fanciful of the 4 orders, and it corresponded to the floor of the residence. So this was a dramatic and perfectly classicizing staircase, really a ramp, and it was built with the intention of being able to accommodate the Pope or any of his entourage on horseback, which is why it is a ramp rather than steps. So you can imagine the Pope entering this and riding up to his villa on horseback. Just for a moment, I also wanted to go back to Bramante's project for New St. Peter's. What we're seeing on the left is the ground plan. Now this is fairly hypothetical because our historians don't have a perfect ground plan that looks like this from Bramante's design. But instead what we do have is only half, and that's been rotated around an axis. And on the right side we see a medal executed at the time of Bramante's role as architect of New St. Peter's, and this is what it was intended to look like as a whole. So you can see again his interest in a centrally planned structure and in a hierarchy of domes. You can see a number of different domes in this context, and so it would have been all centered around the body of St. Peter, which was buried directly in the center here, and then it would have acted as a sort of ambulatory space, a place for processions to take place around the body of St. Peter. So it doesn't end up getting built this way. There ends up being about a dozen different architects in the project of New St. Peter's, but Bramante is credited with beginning the project and in many ways shaping its eventual outcome. So now I'd like to move on to the work of Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo was from Florence. Actually, he was from the village of Vinci, which is where his name Da Vinci comes from Vinci. So it's actually far more appropriate to refer to him as Leonardo than as Da Vinci. He spent most of his career in Florence, although he also worked in Milan and in France, where he actually died. And in Milan and France, he was working as a court artist. In many ways, Leonardo can be considered this perfect Renaissance man. He was an artist and a scientist, and he had an insatiable desire to learn, to explore, and to invent. There's actually a very small number of actual artworks produced during his lifetime, and not many of these have survived. Many of his works were left unfinished. He is known to have trained with the sculptor and painter Verrocchio, whose work of the baptism of Christ I'm showing you here. And the reason I'm showing you this is because these two angels down below are those mentioned by Vasari as having been executed by Leonardo, and how after this was finished, Verrocchio never again would take up the art of painting because he was bested by one of the students. You can also see the hand of Leonardo in the background here, and this should look very much to you like the background of the Mona Lisa, which we will see shortly. I wanted to just show you a few drawings that come from Leonardo's notebooks. He was always in study of nature and experimenting. He's known to have done dissections, so the fact that he's showing this cut open uterus with a fetus, that doesn't necessarily mean that he dissected a dead pregnant woman, but he had an understanding of what was going on inside the body. So among his drawings, we see lots that are for several different inventions, especially ones that can be used for warfare and fortification, which, as you can imagine, his patron was very pleased with. He's very good at drawing, and so you get a very good sense of how these machines might work, and then there's always accompanying texts as well. Other studies seem to have been more personal, like those that he drew of wings that could be used for flight by humans. And the wings especially were never workable despite his in-depth study. There were all sorts of problems with the physics of airflow and lift that he wasn't quite understanding. Here's just another drawing of anatomy showing you just how much of an understanding he had of the muscular system because he did dissections, but this led to a new naturalism in his painting, creating the body from the muscles outwards. He also did a number of botanical studies, probably for a treatise on science that was never finished. What I'm showing you here is called the Star of Bethlehem, and it's very characteristic of his plant drawings. They pulsate with life. There's extremely fine draftsmanship at work here. You see a dynamic sense of growth in these botanical specimens. And they're also related to his water drawings, which I don't think I included in my slideshow today. The evidence of his interest in the natural world appears in his other paintings, as does the same idea of motion, and I will point that out when we can see that. And we see some of these plant studies reappearing in his paintings. I wanted to show you his most famous drawing, what is probably his most famous drawing, the Vitruvian Man on the left side here. Now this is an adaptation of what the writer Vitruvius said about the perfect proportion of the human body. Now Vitruvius was the only surviving architectural treatise from antiquity, and in that he talked about how the human body could define a perfect circle and a square as the body could be inscribed in it. And in architecture, the body was often used as the prototype for perfect proportion. So I wanted to briefly discuss this Annunciation scene because it's a subject we've looked at quite a few times, in the past, also because it gives you a really good sense of how his drawings came to be incorporated into his paintings. So what we're seeing is on the left, very traditionally, you have Angel Gabriel, who's just flown in. He's very still and calm though, as is the Virgin Mary to the right side. She's been sitting on a seat with this very classicizing table in front of her. Her book is on this lectern. She uses her fingers to mark her place, and with her other hand she acts in surprise. But if you look around, look at the ground covered in all of these very carefully picked out plant specimens. Also, if you look at the drapery of the figures in the angel, but especially in the drapery of the Virgin Mary, these seem very closely related to his plant studies, but also his studies of water, seeing how gravity affects these things, how clothing might pool in the same way that water does. Something I will talk about throughout the rest of this lecture is the naturalism of Leonardo. And if I go back to this image by Botticelli, Leonardo makes Botticelli look like a cartoonist practically. There's just something about Leonardo's painting techniques that really create a naturalistic environment. They create a warmth to almost any scene that he paints. You also see his significant interest in plant studies in his two versions of what's called the Madonna of the Rocks. So we have two examples of this, one in the Louvre and one in the National Gallery in London. I'm going to focus on the one in the Louvre for now. In these paintings, we see the Virgin in the very center, sort of enclosed in a grotto of sorts, where she gestures over the head of Christ, who's seated on the ground, she embraces the little John the Baptist who has come here, and then an angel attends them as well. It's this very intimate scene, and it blends almost seamlessly with the background. Leonardo was known for using a technique that art historians now call sfumato, and that means smoky, and that's what he would do to sort of blend the edges of figures. There's no harsh outlines. He would make the edges softer and sometimes darker. It's a type of modeling technique in order to create a new naturalism that isn't present in the work of someone like Botticelli, for example. We see something similar going on in the London version, although the outlines feel a bit harsher here. The modeling is a bit more severe. The brights are a bit brighter. But for the most part, these are very similar compositions. Of course, there are a few differences, especially in the facial features, also in the gesture of this angel. But again, they're enclosed in this grotto-like space in this natural environment, surrounded by these beautiful plants that are almost directly from Leonardo's studies of nature. I'd like to now turn to what is potentially Leonardo's most famous work while he was in Milan working. He had written a letter to Ludovico Sforza emphasizing his abilities as an architect and an engineer, especially of war machines. And he ends the letter by saying, "Oh, and by the way, I can paint too." While in Milan, one of the major works he had planned to do was a double life-size equestrian portrait of Francesco Sforza, Ludovico's father, and Vasari writes about the fate of that equestrian statue. Of that horse, we have preparatory drawings that survive, even though only a full-scale model was produced to add to decorations in 1493, and this would have been done in bronze. But instead, the major project Leonardo works on while he's in Milan is the Last Supper, dating from 1495 to 1498. And this is in that same church that Bramante added the tribune to, Santa Maria delle Grazie, which is the Dominican church in the city of Milan. It was probably commissioned by Ludovico Sforza to decorate the living space for the Dominican monks because this was their refectory, this was their dining hall. We assume that he was the patron because at the very top you have the names of Ludovico and his wife, plus the coats of arms of the two families, the Sforza and the d'Este. Now the painting is in a rather ruined state, largely because Leonardo was experimenting with materials in its execution. So this has undergone years and years of restoration in order to bring it to this clarified state that we can see it in today. But typically a wall painting in the Renaissance is done in fresco, but Leonardo was trying to use both oil and fresco and tempera paint on plaster in order to harness the best qualities of each of these things. And it was starting to deteriorate even in his lifetime, so we see that it wasn't that successful of an experiment. So the subject of the Last Supper is Christ at dinner with his 12 apostles shortly before being crucified. This was a fairly common subject matter, especially in Tuscany. We have quite a few examples of Last Suppers. So what I'm showing you here is an earlier version from Florence by Andrea del Castagno. You typically see all of the apostles gathered around the table, Christ in the center, and then often on the other side of the table to mark him as distinct and separate from the rest of the disciples, you have Judas, who is always shown as much uglier than his comrades. In Leonardo's version, the composition, the arrangement, and the manner of depiction all are working together to emphasize the two most important components of this painting. The first thing is this narrative moment. So Leonardo has chosen to depict the scene at the very moment that Christ has said, "One of you is about to betray me." So that is the first thing, and I'll go into some detail about that in a moment. The second major component of this painting is this is the time, the Last Supper, when Christ initiates the liturgical sacrament of the Eucharist. We see Christ's arms spread open right now in the gesture of a priest, where he reaches for the bread and the wine at the table, symbolic of the Eucharist. So the composition is ordered with clarity in mind. So Leonardo uses perfect one-point perspective, which you can see through the tops of these tapestries hanging on the wall, as well as the coffered ceiling. Everything converges at the point of the top of Christ's head. He's almost haloed by these open windows looking out into a landscape. Then you even have the apostles in a very harmonious disposition, even though they're quite unsettled if you start to think about it. Leonardo puts them in 4 groups of 3, so you can see them distinctly here, 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 and here. Each is reacting in his own way. So like Castagno and others before him, Leonardo is organizing this with all the figures on one side of the table for clarity. And the arrangement of the figures is also important for telling us the story. It also allows for an emphasis on the part of Leonardo on the emotional and psychological intensity of the reactions of the apostles. So Christ in the center is separated from the other figures. He's this perfect, triangular, stable shape right in the center. He's very calm and composed compared to the psychological turmoil of the figures around him. We have figures over here gesturing wildly, speaking to one another, others petitioning him, everyone doing something different with their hands, trying to understand what they've just heard, denying that it wouldn't be them, accusing others. Leonardo is also showing his knowledge of the Bible here. Each apostle is shown acting in accordance to his temperament, and it activates the scene with energy, although at the same time it's very contained. You've got all sorts of elements working together to make the scene very calm and balanced, when in fact it's something of a chaotic scene. There's lots of symbolism added into this painting. For example, you see these groupings of 3 and 4, these very important numbers associated with various symbols. The 3 is the symbol of the Trinity. You see that in the groupings of 3, but also in the 3 windows in the back. In the use of geometry, we see Leonardo idealizing the Last Supper. So it's a type of human nature, but it's very carefully controlled. This painting is actually just so stunning in person. I recently saw it for the first time, and my breath was taken away for the entire 15 minutes that they let you in there. I came to really understand why it became so famous, basically immediately after it was executed. It is nothing short of perfection, which is something that I don't typically say. It's not good for an art historian to be subjective like that, but it's just really an amazing painting, and I can't even imagine how it must have looked originally before the serious deterioration of the paint because of his experimental technique, but also because the monks ended up cutting a large doorway through the bottom of the painting, and this wall has a tendency to stay very wet. Not to mention that when Napoleon invaded Milan, his troops were stabled there, and they did target practice at this painting, and the majority of this room was demolished in a bombing in World War II, although this painting managed to be saved. So one composition that we see Leonardo returning to over and over again is the Madonna and Child with St. Anne. It seems to be this problem that he couldn't quite solve, that he was interested in finding various approaches to how to harmonize 3 figures, 2 adults and a baby, and showing them in an intimate type of pose. The most famous work that he completes that includes this common composition is this cartoon, the Madonna and Child with St. Anne and John the Baptist to the right here, and this is more commonly referred to as the Burlington House cartoon. So drawings were used by artists in many different ways, but primarily as a way to prepare for a larger work of art or composition. This was one of the first things that a young apprentice would learn to do in a Renaissance workshop, and was integral to the artistic process. So the cartoon is the final drawing that an artist would complete prior to a painting. So they would have done lots of separate figural studies and then other drawings showing how to bring those together, whereas the cartoon was the final prepared drawing brought to a very high level of completion, which can then be transferred to a wall or a canvas by a number of different techniques. Because of this transferal process, many cartoons do not survive. This cartoon in particular, we're not sure that it was ever actually turned into a finished painting. Even though I'm calling this a cartoon, scholars do debate over whether it can be even called that, since it hasn't been linked to any existing works. So perhaps it could also be read as a presentation drawing, one that is completed and then given to someone as a gift, although that was rare until the later career of Michelangelo. So here we see St. Anne as our stable foundation here in the center. She looks to her right side, to the viewer's left, at her daughter, Saint Mary, who is seated in her lap. Mary holds the Christ child who leans over the leg of Anne to give a blessing gesture to the small John the Baptist who has come for a visit. His sfumato technique is quite evident here. Again, that's that smoky haze that softens the outlines. It's similar to later techniques called chiaroscuro, where you have a very sharp contrast between light and dark, and it's a method of giving relief to the figures, a method of modeling. Their bodies are quite noticeable through their clothes, which gives them volume. And here he seems to have finally conquered the problem of combining the two adult figures with those of the children in a pyramidal composition. The pyramid was considered a very stable and harmonious approach to an overall composition. We see their limbs and their glances intertwine, and the bodies of the figures are rendered in complex positions. But the faces of the figures emerge serenely from the background, as if they are perfectly comfortable in this somewhat contorted pose that they're standing in. So it's a very important work. This is in the National Gallery in London today, kept in its own special dark room, and it, like so many of Leonardo's works, is just incredible to see in person. Here we see another executed composition for the Madonna and Child with St. Anne composition. And this work in particular is often cited for its realistic depiction of the Alps in the background, which is closely connected to his studies of nature and observation. We see that the Madonna's drapery, especially the blue here, remains unfinished. This isn't just damage, it's not a finished painting. And again, like with the cartoon, we have a graceful intertwining of figures. And this is one solution to that compositional problem of incorporating these figures all together. Again, we have a pyramidal composition, but we see this sweetness, these interactions between the figures as one mother looks to her child, as the next looks to her own child. They're in this nice line of sight connecting all three figures here. They have these very sweet expressions, but there's actually an undertone of melancholy in this as Christ reaches for this lamb. This can be read as a symbol of his future death. And so Mary seems to reach for him with a bit of a melancholy expression on her face as well. In this work, we have a great example of atmospheric perspective, which we talked about first with the work of Masaccio. There's a very high level of detail in the foreground, and then everything sort of evanesces in the background. It becomes hazier and grayer at the horizon line. Now moving on to Leonardo's other extremely famous work, the Mona Lisa. Here we have a portrait of a Florentine noblewoman, which has led to much speculation about her identity, about her smile, as I'm sure you all know, and all the time news articles are appearing about some new researcher has discovered something new about the Mona Lisa. So Vasari tells us that she is the wife of a Florentine citizen named Francesco Bartolomeo del Giocondo, her name being Lisa Gherardini. This is what Vasari tells us, and remember he also talks about how Leonardo employed jugglers and jesters to keep her with a delighted expression, although we really don't have a great deal of evidence that this is in fact the sitter. It seems most portraits were commissions, but what's very strange is that Leonardo actually carried this around with him for the rest of his life, reworking it over and over again. He takes it to France with him, and that's where it is when he dies, which is why it is in the Louvre today. So if this was a commissioned portrait, it should have gone to the patron who paid for it. Again, we have an excellent example of Leonardo's sfumato technique. So we see the woman seated here. She's actually seated on a balcony. You can get a sense of this railing behind her and the bases of two columns framing her on either side. The painting used to be a bit wider and was cut down on each side. She's seated in this round-backed chair, her arms resting on the armrest. Behind her, you see this very illusionistic landscape. It's very hazy. You see water leading to mountains in the background. And then her dress is kind of interesting as well. It's kind of nondescript, and we see Leonardo playing with his illusionistic techniques, especially in this veil over her head. You can see how translucent he was able to make it, the way her drapery also goes over her shoulder. Look at it, and he's playing around with how he can depict the twists and the folds in the fabric. What we're seeing here is an example of idealized female beauty. She has no eyebrows. She has a plucked hairline and a very subtle smile. As I said, the dress is relatively nondescript. It's not overly lavish, and she's not wearing a lot of jewelry. And this is quite unusual for Renaissance portraits. So, for example, this is another portrait by Leonardo of Ginevra da Vinci. This can be found in the National Gallery in Washington. And this is a portrait of another noblewoman. Notice her very nice coiffure, her beautiful clothing, and her headpiece back here. She's not wearing a lot of jewels either, but she's a bit more ornate than the Mona Lisa. With the Mona Lisa, we see Leonardo doing something brand new in female portraiture. So again, he's utilizing this perfect pyramidal composition that we've seen him emphasizing in several of his works now. But this is one of the first times in a portrait that you see a female sitter turned this much towards the viewer. She's in what's called three-quarter view, looking out and engaging the viewer. Typically, portraits of women were commissioned at the time of their weddings. And so they're often shown in very lavish clothing, and she is not. So it's hard to know exactly what's going on here. And this pose and this approach to a sitter is adapted by other artists. This becomes a new standard for portrait type, so it's very, very influential. I want to show you a couple examples of earlier portraits of Florentine women, what the tradition that Leonardo was coming out of and changing. Very, very often they are shown in profile. So the three-quarter view was quite different. Here we have an unidentified young woman painted by Botticelli around 1475. She's wearing fairly nice clothing. She's obviously not that aristocratic, or her garments would be much nicer. Here's another example by Botticelli again, and here we can see that we're dealing with a woman of a higher class. You can tell by her very nice clothing. You can see how it's lined with embroidery, and gold leaf has been used to pick that out. You can see the pearls woven into her very elaborate hairstyle, even at her part of her hair. And again, you've got a good example of a plucked hairline. They really liked that high forehead. Here's another example by Ghirlandaio, who was the teacher of Michelangelo as a young man. Again, we see her in lavish costume. It's a very high quality garment. We see many layers of this. And then she's outfitted in this beautiful yellow cloak with damask patterning. Her hair is done very carefully. You see all sorts of jewels both on her chest here, as well as in the background. And so Leonardo's is quite the departure than what came before. Instead of Botticelli's carefully delineated outlines, we have that nice sfumato technique. We see a greater interest in utilizing atmospheric perspective in the portrait in order to create a more naturalistic setting. So with the work of Leonardo, what I want you to really remember is his emphasis on naturalism. He's a very eclectic artist and thinker who very rarely finished works because he seemed to be so preoccupied with the next thing, with always discovering something new. And even though his works are now so famous, I mean, you can buy them on coffee mugs and umbrellas and anything else that you can think of, he is really a fundamental artist of the High Renaissance, and he comes to impact later artists, including Michelangelo and Raphael. He's just a bit older than those two artists. We see a lot of his most interesting work in his drawings, including this, which is often cited as a self-portrait. We actually have no evidence that that is the case. Instead, we see this really interesting study of the head of an old man. There's hardly any lines on this paper. You can see the hair and the beard picked out with individual lines, but then you have this very subtle shading in order to give these incredible contours to the wrinkled face of this elderly man. We also see him very carefully studying the proportion of the face. So what we're seeing here is this profile that has then been gridded over in order to understand how the proportions of the face could work. Now, there's several different possibilities for proportion, but we see him testing out one method here. And then again in his drawings, we just see this such careful attention to detail, this sfumato naturalistic technique, which makes the figure seem to emerge out of the paper as if there is no artist's hand here, but instead we've got this very refined portrait technique. Even though this is maybe not an individual he actually saw, this could be somebody out of his mind completely, out of the inspiration of Leonardo, but you can really get a sense of the actual physicality of this figure, the bulging sacs under his eyes, the wrinkles and the folds of his face, his dramatically sloped nose and chin reaching towards each other. So he's always thinking about how he can make things look as real as possible. And his nature studies become a fundamental example of that, and his interest in anatomy. Here we see him exploring the grotesque, that is, faces that have devolved into, that have a feature that has just overtaken their face. This poor woman over here, she's quite terrifying looking, as are all of them. But we see him being very interested in things like the grotesque in order to better refine his technique. This sheet I love in particular because if you look at the hatching that he uses to create a background and that become a fundamental part of these figures and framing them and profiling them. And I just want to show you one final image by Leonardo, when in fact this is a copy of a drawing done by Leonardo da Vinci. I bring this up because I will also talk about this in my lecture on Michelangelo. What we're seeing here is his composition for what's called the Battle of Anghiari. He was commissioned, along with Michelangelo, to fresco a large room in the Palazzo della Signoria, the city hall of Florence. Each artist was to have an opposing wall, each representing an important battle from Florentine history. And we see two extremely different conceptions and approaches, which really epitomize the different pictorial techniques of Leonardo and of Michelangelo. So with Leonardo, we see this cluster of chaos. We see these horses rearing up, trampling soldiers who have fallen below, these grotesque faces, these contorted figures turning in the heat of battle, trying to overcome this lance that has been cast towards him, trying to defeat enemies on horseback. You even see so much drama that the horses are even biting at each other. But the naturalism is almost unreal in the musculature of the horses, in the modeling of the faces. Leonardo has this ability to really bring any scene to life, to create this dynamism and energy from the painting or drawing medium. So he's this very virtuosic artist, extremely important for later works and for his contemporaries as well. So that is where we will conclude the lecture today. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've learned a great deal about Bramante and Leonardo. I will see you for Module 6.